June 14, 1943, Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Dawn broke hot and humid over the pine forests as Oberfeldwebel Karl Hoffmann stepped from the prisoner barracks, convinced this would be another day of American neglect and meager provisions. The decorated veteran of the Afrika Korps believed the Americans, especially the black soldiers assigned as their guards, would treat German prisoners with contempt, a belief that would be challenged in ways he could never have anticipated. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how a simple act of shared food became the first crack in the foundation of Nazi ideology for a group of captured German soldiers. The journey to Camp Claiborne had been long and disorienting. Just 3 weeks earlier, Hoffmann had been commanding a machine gun position outside Tunis as part of the last German defense in North Africa. Now he found himself in the sweltering Louisiana heat, surrounded by tall pines and the constant drone of cicadas, a prisoner of war alongside 42 other members of the 15th Panzer Division. "Another day in paradise," muttered Werner Schmidt, a lanky artillery observer from Munich as he joined Hoffmann outside. Schmidt had been captured 2 days before Hoffmann when American Sherman tanks overran his observation post. At 22, he was one of the younger prisoners, but 3 years of combat had aged his face beyond his years. "The Americans will process us soon," Hoffmann assured him. "We'll be assigned proper work details according to the Geneva Convention. Field Marshal Rommel will have ensured his men are treated with proper respect." Schmidt made a non-committal noise. They both knew the Afrika Korps had been decisively defeated. Over 275 Zero-Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia, a catastrophic loss of manpower for the Third Reich. But Hoffmann clung to his dignity and the certainties that had sustained him through the war. "Have you seen our guards?" Schmidt asked, lowering his voice despite the language barrier between them and their captors. "Negroes. The Americans put Negroes to guard German soldiers." Hoffmann nodded grimly. "They mean to insult us. The Americans know exactly what they're doing." This perception was shared among most of the German prisoners. They had been captured by white American troops, processed through holding facilities staffed primarily by white officers, then transported to permanent camps where, to their surprise and indignation, many of the guards were black soldiers. What the Germans did not understand, what they could not yet comprehend, was that the United States Army had made a deliberate decision. Black American troops had been systematically denied combat roles in many theaters of the war, despite their willingness to fight. Military authorities, reflecting the racial attitudes prevalent in 1940s America, had assigned many black units to support and guard duties instead of frontline combat. The 761st Military Police Battalion, stationed at Camp Claiborne, was one such unit. Its men performed their duties with professionalism, despite serving in an army that maintained segregated facilities, separate dining halls, and unequal treatment for its own soldiers based on race. First Sergeant William Jefferson had been with the 761st since its formation. At 34, he had 11 years of military service, having joined the army long before the war, as one of the few stable careers available to a black man from rural Georgia. He stood ramrod straight as he surveyed the morning roll call of prisoners, his dark eyes missing nothing. "All present and accounted for, sir," Jefferson reported to Lieutenant Ellis, the white officer in charge of this section of the camp. "Very good, Sergeant," Ellis replied, barely glancing at the clipboard. "The new work details start today. I want 20 men for the lumber mill and 15 for the field kitchen." "Yes, sir. I'll organize the details immediately." As Jefferson turned to assign the prisoners, he noticed Hoffmann's cold stare. Jefferson had grown accustomed to these looks from the German POWs, many of whom made no attempt to hide their contempt. Nazi racial ideology had taught them that black people were inherently inferior. Finding themselves guarded by men they had been told were subhuman was a daily affront to their worldview. Jefferson met Hoffmann's gaze steadily, then deliberately turned away. He had his orders and his duty. The personal opinions of Nazi prisoners meant nothing to him. "Schmidt, Hoffmann, Weiss, Müller," Jefferson called out, reading from his clipboard. "Kitchen detail today." Hoffmann stiffened, but stepped forward. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, Officers could not be compelled to work, but non-commissioned officers like Hoffmann could be assigned to supervisory roles. As an Oberfeldwebel, roughly equivalent to an American master sergeant, Hoffmann took a certain pride in maintaining military discipline among his fellow prisoners, even in captivity. "The rest of you men," Jefferson continued, "will report to Corporal Thomas for transport to the lumber mill." The prisoners broke into their assigned groups. Hoffmann, Schmidt, and 11 others followed Private James Cooper toward the camp kitchen. Cooper was a young soldier from Philadelphia, not more than 20 years old, with a quiet manner that concealed a sharp intelligence. "You'll be peeling potatoes, washing dishes, and helping prepare meals for the camp," Cooper explained as they walked. "Any questions?" None of the Germans responded. Most had limited English, and those who did understand chose not to engage more than necessary. The kitchen was a long, low building with industrial stoves, massive preparation tables, and a perpetual cloud of steam hanging in the air. The heat inside was even more oppressive than the Louisiana summer outside. Staff Sergeant Moses Washington, a former restaurant cook from Chicago, ran the kitchen with the precision of a military operation. "These the new helpers?" Washington asked Cooper. "Yes, Sergeant, 13 men as ordered." Washington nodded and began assigning tasks. Hoffmann and Schmidt were directed to a mountain of potatoes waiting to be peeled. "The Americans waste food like no one I've ever seen," Schmidt muttered in German as they worked. "Look at the size of these potato peelings. In Germany, we would be scraping them much thinner." Hoffmann nodded. "They have no concept of scarcity. America has not felt the war as we have." This observation wasn't entirely accurate, but it reflected what the German soldiers had been told about America. A land of wasteful abundance, untouched by bombing or privation. What they couldn't know was that Americans too faced rationing. Meat, sugar, coffee, and gasoline were all carefully controlled. The difference was one of degree, not kind. As the morning progressed, the German prisoners watched the black American soldiers at work. Despite themselves, they noted the efficiency with which the kitchen operated, the clear chain of command, and the professional manner of their guards. This didn't align with what they had been told about black Americans, but most dismissed these contradictions, retreating to their ideological certainties. Around 10:30, Sergeant Washington called out, "Take 5, everyone, get some water and cool off." The kitchen staff stepped outside for a brief respite from the heat. Hoffmann noticed that Corporal Miller, one of the guards, was opening a small package wrapped in waxed paper. "What's that you've got there, Miller?" Washington asked. "Package from home," Miller replied with a smile. "My mama sent bacon." "Real bacon, not that processed stuff we get here." "Man, I haven't had proper bacon in months," another guard, Private Wilson, said longingly. Miller laughed. "Well, I aim to fry some up now while we got the break. Anyone wants a taste is welcome." The American soldiers gathered around as Miller carefully cut a few precious slices from his package. The aroma of frying bacon soon filled the air outside the kitchen door. Inside, Schmidt nudged Hoffmann. "Smell that? The guards are cooking something for themselves, not sharing with the prisoners, of course." Hoffmann shrugged. "Why would they? They're under no obligation to share personal food." But the scent of the bacon was tantalizing, triggering memories of home and better times. Several of the German prisoners drifted toward the door, drawn by the aroma. When Miller finished cooking, he divided the bacon among his fellow soldiers, tiny portions for each man. Then, to the Germans' surprise, he looked up at them. "Y'all want some?" he asked. The prisoners stared, not understanding the offer or not believing it. Hoffmann stepped forward. "You are offering us your personal food?" he asked in careful English. "It ain't much to share," Miller said, "but my mama always said good food tastes better with company." There was a moment of hesitation. Then Schmidt stepped forward and accepted a small piece of bacon. The other prisoners followed suit, murmuring "Danke" as they received their portions. It was a small moment, unremarkable in many ways, yet Hoffmann felt a disturbance in his certainties. This simple act of sharing didn't align with what he believed about these men. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythms of the camp. The Germans returned to their barracks in the evening, discussing the day's work and the strange encounter with the bacon. "It was just for show," insisted Dieter Weiss, a former Hitler youth leader who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1941. They knew their officers might be watching. They wanted to appear magnanimous. There were no officers present, Hoffman pointed out. Then perhaps they were mocking us, Weiss replied, showing that they have such abundance they can afford to waste food on prisoners. But Hoffman wasn't convinced. He had seen genuine generosity in the gesture, and it troubled him. It was easier to hate an enemy who conformed to your expectations. The following morning, Hoffman's group was assigned to the kitchen again. As they walked to work, they passed the black soldiers' quarters and noticed something strange. "Look at their barracks," Schmidt whispered. "They're separate from the white soldiers." Indeed, the camp was clearly divided. The white officers and enlisted men had quarters in one section, while the black soldiers were housed separately, their facilities visibly more basic. "They segregate their own army?" Hoffman asked, surprised. "Of course they do," Weiss cut in. "Americans understand racial realities as well as we do." But Hoffman was troubled by the contradiction. If Americans considered their black soldiers inferior, why trust them with guarding valuable prisoners? And if the blackguards were treated as second class by their own army, why didn't they show more resentment toward their prisoners? In the kitchen, Sergeant Washington was already preparing breakfast for the camp's 200 inhabitants. The menu was simple: powdered eggs, reconstituted milk, bread, and coffee. "Hoffman, Schmidt," Washington called out. "You two help Cooper with the bread delivery." Cooper was loading large trays of bread into a small truck for distribution to the various mess halls throughout the camp. "The Germans get the same bread as everyone else," Cooper explained as they worked. "Geneva Convention says POWs get the same rations as base troops." "Your mess halls are also segregated?" Hoffman asked, gesturing toward the separate buildings where food would be delivered. Cooper's face showed a flicker of something, anger perhaps or resignation, before returning to its professional mask. "That's just how it is. The truck made deliveries first to the white officers' mess, then to the enlisted white soldiers' dining hall, and finally to the black soldiers' facility." Hoffman noticed that while the basic rations were the same, the white officers' mess had additional items: fresh fruit, proper butter instead of margarine. "The food is different," Hoffman observed. "Officers get better chow," Cooper replied simply. "Same in your army, isn't it?" "Yes," Hoffman acknowledged, "but all German soldiers are treated equally regardless of—" He stopped, realizing the implication. Cooper gave him a long look but said nothing. The contradiction nagged at Hoffman throughout the day. The Nazi ideology had been clear about the racial hierarchy, with Germanic peoples at the top and others, especially black people, near the bottom. Yet here were these black American soldiers, clearly disciplined and competent, guarding white German prisoners while being treated as inferior by their own countrymen. That evening, a small incident occurred that would further crack Hoffman's worldview. As the prisoners returned to their barracks, Werner Schmidt collapsed suddenly, clutching his abdomen. "Medic!" Hoffman shouted automatically. "We need a medic!" Private Wilson, one of the guards, immediately radioed for assistance, while Corporal Thomas knelt beside Schmidt. "What's wrong with him?" Thomas asked Hoffman. "He has had stomach pains for days," Hoffman explained. "He says it is nothing, but I can see he is in agony." Within minutes, a jeep arrived with Captain Reynolds, one of the camp's doctors. Reynolds examined Schmidt briefly. "Appendicitis," he declared. "We need to get him to the infirmary immediately." As they loaded Schmidt onto the jeep, Reynolds turned to Hoffman. "Has he complained about this pain before?" "For 3 days," Hoffman admitted. "He did not want to appear weak." Reynolds shook his head. "The appendix could have ruptured. That can be fatal without prompt surgery." After the jeep departed, Hoffman stood silent, concerned for his comrade. Corporal Thomas approached him. "Your friend will be okay," Thomas said. "Captain Reynolds is a good doctor." "Will he treat a German prisoner properly?" Hoffman asked, his tone suggesting doubt. Thomas's expression hardened. "Captain Reynolds is a doctor. He treats everyone who needs medical attention." The implied rebuke silenced Hoffman. He returned to the barracks and found several prisoners engaged in a heated discussion. "They took Schmidt to the same hospital where they treat their own men," reported Klaus Müller, who had gathered information from one of the English-speaking guards. "There is no separate facility for prisoners." That cannot be right, insisted Weiss. The Americans would not waste proper medical care on enemy soldiers. The Geneva Convention requires it, Hoffman pointed out. Since when do Americans care about international law? Scoffed Weiss. They're probably experimenting on him. The baseless accusation angered Hoffman. That's enough, Weiss. You speak of things you know nothing about. The next morning, Lieutenant Ellis visited the barracks during roll call. Your man Schmidt is recovering well, he informed the prisoners. The surgery was successful, and he'll remain in the infirmary for about a week. A ripple of relief passed through the German prisoners. For many, it was the first concrete evidence that they would indeed receive proper treatment as prisoners of war. When Hoffman's group reported to the kitchen that morning, Sergeant Washington had news. We're short-handed today, he announced. 2 of my regular men are out sick, so I need extra help with breakfast preparation. Hoffman found himself working alongside Private Wilson at one of the preparation tables, slicing hundreds of pieces of bread for toast. The task was monotonous, but not difficult. Your friend is doing well, Wilson said conversationally as they worked. My cousin works in the infirmary, says your man was joking with the nurses this morning. Hoffman was surprised by both the information and the friendly tone. Thank you for telling me, he replied stiffly. You served with Rommel's Afrika Korps? Wilson asked, nodding toward the distinctive tan uniform shirt Hoffman still wore, now without insignia. Yes, 15th Panzer Division. Tough outfit, Wilson acknowledged. You gave our boys hell before Tunis fell. Hoffman didn't know how to respond to this professional respect from an enemy, especially one he had been conditioned to consider inferior. You have been in combat? Hoffman asked, genuinely curious. Wilson's face clouded. No, they don't let us fight much. Mostly put us in service units, guard duty, driving trucks. Been trying to get transferred to a combat unit since Pearl Harbor. The frustration in Wilson's voice was unmistakable. Hoffman found himself unexpectedly sympathetic. As a professional soldier, he understood the pride of belonging to a combat unit. You want to fight, but they will not allow it? Some black units are fighting now, Wilson said. The 99th Pursuit Squadron just deployed to North Africa. All black pilots. And there's talk about more combat units being formed. But mostly they tell us we're more useful behind the lines. This information contradicted what German propaganda had claimed, that black Americans lacked the courage and ability for combat. Yet here was this man, clearly desperate for the chance to prove himself in battle. Their conversation was interrupted when Sergeant Washington called Wilson away for another task. Hoffman continued his work, his mind troubled by new thoughts. At midday, a new group of prisoners arrived at the camp. Fresh captures from Tunisia, they had just completed processing at the main reception center and were being distributed to permanent camps across the country. Among them was Lieutenant Hans Müller, a young officer from the 10th Panzer Division. Unlike many of the earlier arrivals, Müller appeared thin and haggard. The shipping was difficult, Müller explained when Hoffman asked about his condition. Food was scarce on the transport ship. Many men became ill. But you will be fed properly here, Hoffman assured him. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention. We receive the same basic rations as their troops. Müller looked skeptical. That is not what we were told to expect in American captivity. Much of what we were told has proven false, Hoffman replied quietly. Later that afternoon, while working in the kitchen, Hoffman overheard a conversation between Sergeant Washington and Corporal Thomas. Got a letter from my brother in the 92nd Engineers, Thomas was saying. They're building airfields in North Africa, working around the clock, says it's 120 degrees in the shade. Tougher than guard duty here, Washington acknowledged. How's his unit holding up? Proud of what they're doing, Thomas replied. Says they're part of something important, even if they're not on the front lines. They know those airfields mean Allied planes can keep pounding German positions. Hoffman pretended not to understand, but he absorbed every word. The 92nd Engineers were obviously another black unit, contributing significantly to the war effort, despite being kept from combat roles. It was a perspective on the American war machine he had never considered. That evening, the new prisoners were introduced to camp routines. Hoffman, as one of the senior NCOs, helped explain the work details and rules. The guards are Negroes, one of the newcomers observed with contempt. "The Americans insult us." "The guards are professional soldiers doing their duty," Hoffman corrected him sharply, surprising himself with his own response. "You will treat them with military courtesy." The next morning brought a change to routine. A supply truck had broken down, delaying the arrival of the day's food shipment. Breakfast would be served late. "We're going to have to improvise," Sergeant Washington announced to his kitchen staff. "I've got permission to open the emergency rations." These consisted primarily of canned goods, powdered eggs, tinned meat, and preserved fruits. As Washington distributed these items from the storehouse, Hoffman noticed something unexpected. The black soldiers' personal footlockers were stored in the same building, and several soldiers were retrieving items from them. Corporal Miller withdrew a small package and unwrapped several strips of home-cured bacon, clearly the remains of the package he had shared earlier. Private Wilson produced a small jar of what appeared to be homemade preserves. Another guard contributed a few precious onions sent from his family farm. "What are you doing?" Hoffman asked. "Making breakfast a little less terrible," Washington explained. "The emergency rations taste like cardboard. A little extra flavor helps." "But those are your personal supplies," Hoffman pointed out. Washington shrugged. "We all gotta eat. Might as well make it taste good." To Hoffman's astonishment, the guards pooled their personal food items, not just for themselves, but to supplement the entire camp's breakfast. The bacon was chopped fine and used to flavor the powdered eggs. The preserves were mixed with hot water to create a fruit sauce for the bland emergency biscuits. "This is food from your homes," Hoffman said to Wilson as they worked together. "From your families." "Food's meant to be shared," Wilson replied simply. "My granddaddy always said a meal by yourself is just eating, but a meal with others is living." As the improvised breakfast was distributed to the camp's various mess halls, Hoffman noticed that the portions were carefully measured to ensure fairness. The German prisoners would receive the same enhanced meal as everyone else. "You share your personal food with enemy prisoners," Hoffman said to Washington, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Washington gave him a long look. "Let me tell you something, Sergeant. Before this war, I was a cook in Chicago, had my own little place, served anybody who was hungry, and had the price of a meal. Didn't care where they came from or what they looked like." He paused, checking a pot of rehydrated eggs cooking on the massive stove. "When I put on this uniform, I didn't stop being who I was. I'm still Moses Washington, still a cook, still believe nobody should go hungry if I can help it." This simple statement of personal identity separate from military role struck Hoffman forcefully. For years, Nazi ideology had emphasized the subordination of individual identity to racial and national categories. Washington was asserting something fundamentally different, that his humanity transcended both his uniform and the conflict they found themselves in. The improvised breakfast was served throughout the camp. When the regular supply truck finally arrived at midday, normal meal service resumed. But something had changed for Hoffman and several of the other prisoners who had witnessed the sharing of personal rations. That evening, Hoffman sat with a small group of trusted comrades outside their barracks, enjoying the relative cool of the Louisiana evening. "They used their own food from home to make our breakfast," Johann Bauer, a young Panzer crewman, was saying. "Food sent by their families. American abundance," Weiss dismissed. "They have so much they can afford such gestures." "No," Hoffman contradicted him. "I saw their personal packages, small amounts, carefully preserved, treasured items from home just as we would value such things." "Why would they share with us?" asked another prisoner. "We are their enemies." Hoffman had been pondering this question all day. "I believe," he said slowly, "it is because they see us as men first, enemies second." This concept, the recognition of common humanity transcending the divisions of war, was revolutionary within the context of the racial ideology many of the Germans had absorbed. Nazi propaganda had emphasized unbridgeable differences between peoples. The simple act of shared food suggested otherwise. The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Ellis and First Sergeant Jefferson. "Good news," Ellis announced. "Your comrade Schmidt is recovering well and will return to the barracks tomorrow." A murmur of approval went through the prisoners. Ellis departed, leaving Jefferson to answer any questions about Schmidt's return. "Will he need special care?" Hoffman asked. Light duty for 2 weeks, Jefferson replied. No heavy lifting. As Jefferson turned to leave, Hoffman found himself saying, Sergeant, thank you for the information, and please convey our appreciation to your men for sharing their personal rations this morning. Jefferson looked back, studying Hoffman's face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded. I'll tell them. Later that night, unable to sleep in the humid barracks, Hoffman stepped outside for air. To his surprise, he found Sergeant Washington sitting alone on a bench, smoking a cigarette. Can't sleep either? Washington asked, offering Hoffman a seat. Hoffman hesitated, then sat. The two men smoked in silence for several minutes. May I ask you something, Sergeant? Hoffman finally said. You can ask. Why do you serve? Your country treats you as... He struggled for the right word. As less than? Washington supplied. Yeah, they do sometimes. Then why fight for them? Washington took a long drag on his cigarette before answering. I'm not fighting for them, I'm fighting for us. For what America should be, not what it is. He gestured toward the camp around them. You see the segregated barracks, the separate mess halls. That's not the America I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for the America that's promised in our Constitution. Freedom and equality for all. We ain't there yet, but we're working on it. He stubbed out his cigarette. And you know what? Every time one of us puts on this uniform, fights in this war, does our job with dignity despite how we're treated, we're claiming our place as full Americans. They can't deny us forever. The conviction in Washington's voice was unmistakable. Here was a man fighting simultaneously in two struggles, against fascism abroad and for equality at home. In Germany, Hoffman said carefully, we are taught that races cannot change their essential nature. Washington laughed, a surprisingly warm sound in the night. In America, we're living proof that nothing stays the same. My grandfather was born a slave. My father was a sharecropper. I owned my own business before the war. My son, if I have one someday, might be anything. A doctor, a lawyer, maybe even a senator. That's change across just 3 generations. He stood to return to his quarters. Think about that, Sergeant Hoffman. People can change. Nations can change. That's what scares your Führer so much, isn't it? The idea that all his theories about fixed racial destiny might just be wrong. Washington walked away, leaving Hoffman alone with thoughts more unsettling than any artillery barrage he had endured in Africa. The next morning, Werner Schmidt returned from the infirmary, moving carefully but in good spirits. The American doctors treated me well, he reported to the curious prisoners, no different from their own wounded. They need healthy prisoners for labor, Weiss insisted, unwilling to attribute humane motives to their captors. Schmidt shook his head. It was more than that. There was a black orderly who spoke some German. He told me his brother is fighting in Italy now with a combat engineer unit. He said he was glad to help me because somewhere an American medic might be helping a wounded German, and that's how wars eventually end, through small acts of decency. Hoffman found himself nodding. The idea resonated with something awakening within him, a recognition that humanity persisted even amid the machinery of war and the poison of ideology. That afternoon, the kitchen staff was preparing the evening meal when a new supply truck arrived. As they unloaded the provisions, a mouth-watering aroma filled the air. "What is that smell?" Hoffman asked Cooper. "Real coffee," Cooper replied with a grin. "Not that substitute stuff, actual coffee beans, special shipment." The entire kitchen staff perked up at this news. Coffee was strictly rationed, with most of the supply reserved for frontline troops. The arrival of real coffee was an unexpected luxury. "How much can each man have?" asked one of the guards. "1 cup per person," Washington announced. "And yes, that includes the prisoners," he added, anticipating the next question. "Geneva Convention says POWs get the same rations as base troops." But it was more than the Geneva Convention at work here, Hoffman realized. It was the extension of shared humanity that had begun with Bacon and continued through personal reserves shared during the supply shortage. The guards could easily have consumed the coffee themselves or claimed it was for Americans only. No one would have questioned such a decision about a luxury item. As Hoffman helped prepare the evening meal, he found himself working alongside men he had been taught to despise. yet he could no longer maintain the mental barriers Nazi ideology had constructed. These were men with families, with hopes, with principles, some of which, like professional military pride and personal honor, he shared. And most disturbing of all, he was beginning to see that the black American Guards, officially second-class citizens in their own country, displayed a devotion to principles of fairness and human dignity that contradicted everything the Third Reich had claimed about racial hierarchies. That evening, as the prisoners savored the unexpected pleasure of real coffee, Hoffman sat with Schmidt and several others who had witnessed the sharing of personal rations. "Something is happening here that I do not fully understand," Hoffman admitted quietly. "These men treat us with a respect we have not earned." "It makes no sense according to what we have been taught," Schmidt agreed. "Inferior races should not behave with such humanity," Hoffman finished for him. "That is the word you are seeking." Across the compound, they could see Sergeant Washington and his men sitting outside their barracks, also enjoying the rare treat of real coffee. Despite the segregated facilities, despite their status as guards and prisoners, despite the war that had brought them together as enemies, there was in that moment a recognition of shared experience that transcended these divisions. "I think," Hoffman said slowly, watching the steam rise from the cups on both sides of the compound, "we have been told many things that may not be true." It was the first tentative step toward a profound realization, one that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks ahead, that the ideology built on racial hierarchy that had helped drive Germany to war might be founded on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. And it had begun with the simple, unexpected aroma of bacon frying on a hot Louisiana morning. The following days brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere at Camp Claiborne. The rigid segregation of prisoners and guards remained in place, a necessity of military protocol, but something had changed in how they perceived one another. Small interactions revealed this evolution. A nod of acknowledgement here, a brief exchange about the weather there, moments of grudging respect. For Hoffman, each day brought new contradictions to the worldview he had carried from Germany. On June 21st, a week after the bacon incident, he was assigned to a maintenance detail with 5 other prisoners. They were tasked with repairing a section of the camp's perimeter fence, under the supervision of Corporal James Miller, the same guard who had first shared his personal bacon ration. "Watch for snakes," Miller warned, as they worked in the tall grass near the fence line. "Cottonmouths like this wet weather," Hoffman translated for the others, noting the practical concern for their safety. It was a small thing, but telling. If the guards viewed the prisoners as mere labor units or subhumans, such warnings would be unnecessary. As they worked, a supply truck rumbled past, heading toward the main gate. Miller checked his watch. "Mail call today," he said, a note of anticipation in his voice. "You expect letters?" Hoffman asked, more to be polite than out of genuine interest. Miller nodded. "From my wife, she's expecting our first child in August." "Congratulations," Hoffman said automatically. "Thanks. She's living with her parents in Kentucky while I'm deployed. Says she's bigger than a house now." Miller smiled at the thought. It was a strangely normal conversation between men who, under different circumstances, might have been neighbors discussing family over a fence rather than captor and captive separated by war. "Do you have family, Sergeant Hoffman?" Miller asked. The question caught Hoffman off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about his personal life rather than his military function. "A wife in Hamburg," he answered after a moment, "and a daughter, 7 years old now. Must be hard being so far from them." Hoffman nodded, not trusting himself to speak further. The simple acknowledgement of his family, of his identity beyond German prisoner or enemy combatant, was unexpectedly affecting. "Maybe you'll get mail soon too," Miller said. "Red Cross packages have been coming through more regularly now." This was welcome news. Communication from home was a lifeline for prisoners, but the chaos of war often disrupted mail service for months. The possibility of news from his family lifted Hoffman's spirits. The fence repair took most of the day. As they worked, Hoffman observed Miller's interaction with the other guards when they passed by. There was camaraderie there, certainly, but also something else, a constant awareness of status. When Lieutenant Ellis approached to check on their progress, Miller's demeanor changed subtly, becoming more formal, more careful. "All going well, Corporal?" Ellis asked. "Yes, sir. We should finish before sunset." Ellis nodded, then added, "The new officer rotation starts tomorrow. Captain Drummond is replacing Captain Wallace as security officer." "Understood, sir," Miller replied, his face carefully neutral. After Ellis departed, Hoffman noticed Miller's shoulders slump slightly. "Is this Captain Drummond not good?" Hoffman asked quietly. Miller hesitated before answering. "Let's just say he's from Mississippi and has some strong opinions about how things should be." The implication was clear enough. The change in command would likely mean stricter enforcement of segregation and possibly harsher treatment for the black guards. That evening, mail call brought a mix of joy and disappointment to the camp. Some prisoners received their first letters since capture, while others waited in vain for news from home. Hoffman was among the fortunate ones, receiving a letter from his wife dated 3 months earlier. She was well, she wrote, though food rationing in Hamburg had become increasingly severe. Their daughter had performed in a school play and missed her father terribly. The letter contained no political content. Such material would have been censored. But between the lines, Hoffman could read his wife's exhaustion and worry. The Allied bombing campaign against German cities had intensified dramatically since he had left for Africa in 1942. Hamburg, a major port and industrial center, was a frequent target. Although his wife didn't explicitly mention the bombing, military censors on both sides would have removed such information. Her casual reference to spending nights in the basement told him everything he needed to know. As Hoffman read and reread the precious letter in his bunk, he found himself thinking of Corporal Miller's wife in Kentucky, safely distant from any threat of bombing or invasion, but facing her own fears as she prepared to bring a child into a world at war. The next morning brought the arrival of Captain Drummond, a tall, thin officer, with a permanent frown etched into his features. His impact on camp operations was immediately apparent. During the morning inspection, he berated First Sergeant Jefferson for what he deemed insufficient discipline among the guards. "These men are soft on the prisoners." Drummond complained loudly to Lieutenant Ellis within earshot of both guards and prisoners. "They're treating Nazis like guests instead of enemies of America." Ellis, who had run the section efficiently for months, merely nodded. "We'll tighten things up, sir." The prisoners watched this exchange with varying reactions. Dieter Weiss seemed almost pleased, as if the new captain's attitude confirmed his beliefs about American racism. Schmidt looked concerned, likely worrying about harsher treatment. Hoffman observed silently, noting the subtle ways the black guards maintained their professional demeanor despite the humiliating public criticism. Later that morning, Sergeant Washington approached Hoffman in the kitchen. "Things are going to be different for a while," he said quietly. "Captain Drummond has new rules, less interaction between prisoners and guards, stricter enforcement of regulations." Hoffman nodded. "We understand military discipline." "This isn't about discipline," Washington replied, his voice low. "It's about making sure everyone stays in their place, by his definition." Before Hoffman could respond, Captain Drummond himself entered the kitchen for an inspection. He moved through the space like a man expecting to find violations, examining every surface and container with exaggerated scrutiny. "Why are these prisoners working without restraints?" Drummond demanded, pointing at Hoffman and Schmidt. "Standard kitchen protocol, sir," Washington replied evenly. "Handcuffs would create a hygiene issue with food preparation." Drummond's expression darkened. "I want all prisoners in restraints unless specifically exempted for medical reasons. Is that clear, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. And there will be no unnecessary conversation between guards and prisoners. Communication should be limited to essential instructions only." "Understood, sir." After Drummond departed, Washington sighed heavily. "Like I said, things will be different." The impact of Drummond's arrival rippled throughout the camp. Work details became more regimented, with less of the casual interaction that had begun to humanize the relationship between captives and captors. Meals were served in silence. Guards who had previously shown small kindnesses now maintained a careful distance. For 3 days, this tenser atmosphere prevailed. The fragile connections that had begun to form seemed in danger of dissolving entirely, replaced by the formal, impersonal relationship prescribed by regulations. Hoffman found himself surprisingly disturbed by this regression. He had not realized how much the small acknowledgements of shared humanity had come to matter. Then came the incident that would crystallize everything. It began on June 26th, a sweltering Saturday, when the temperature reached 102 degrees by midday. Work details had been reduced due to the extreme heat, with prisoners confined to barracks during the hottest hours. The kitchen staff, however, still needed to prepare meals. Hoffman, Schmidt, and 4 other prisoners were working in the stifling kitchen alongside Washington, Cooper, and 2 other guards. Despite Drummond's orders about unnecessary conversation, they worked in a companionable silence born of shared misery in the heat. Shortly after noon, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the kitchen windows, they could see a new convoy of trucks arriving at the camp gates. "More prisoners," Washington observed, wiping sweat from his brow. They watched as the trucks unloaded their human cargo, dozens of German soldiers in the now familiar desert tan of the Afrika Korps, looking disoriented and exhausted from their long journey. Among them, Hoffman spotted the distinctive insignia of the 21st Panzer Division. "Those men fought at El Alamein," he told Schmidt, "veterans of the early desert campaigns." Washington nodded to Cooper. "Better prepare extra rations. Looks like at least 50 new mouths to feed." As the new prisoners were processed through reception, Sergeant Jefferson entered the kitchen. "Captain Drummond wants coffee and sandwiches for the processing officers," he ordered, "and water for the new arrivals. They're dehydrated from the transport." Washington assigned Cooper and Hoffman to prepare the officers' refreshments, while the others organized water distribution for the incoming prisoners. Hoffman silently noted that despite Drummond's harsh attitudes, the basic humanitarian concern for the prisoners' welfare remained operational policy. The processing took hours. By late afternoon, the new prisoners had been assigned temporary quarters until permanent barrack space could be arranged. Hoffman and several other veteran prisoners were asked to help orient the newcomers to camp routines. Among the new arrivals was Hauptmann Erich Keller, a company commander from the 21st Panzer's 104th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Keller was a tall, imposing man with the hard eyes of a dedicated Nazi true believer. His right arm was in a sling, injured during his capture. "This is how the Americans house the master race," Keller sneered as Hoffman showed him the barracks. "With Negro guards watching over us?" "The guards are professional soldiers," Hoffman replied neutrally. "You would be wise to cooperate with camp regulations." Keller gave him a sharp look. "You sound like you admire these Americans." "I recognize military competence when I see it," Hoffman said carefully. "Or perhaps you've become too comfortable in captivity," Keller suggested, "forgotten what these people truly are." Hoffman didn't respond to the provocation, instead continuing his explanation of camp routines. But Keller's arrival troubled him. The Hauptmann represented the hardcore ideological certainty that Hoffman himself had begun to question. That evening, as the prisoners gathered in the mess hall for dinner, Keller made a point of inspecting his food with exaggerated disgust. "They expect German soldiers to eat this slop," he declared loudly to the assembled prisoners, both veterans and newcomers. "The food is adequate," Schmidt countered, "the same as what the American enlisted men receive." Keller's eyes narrowed. "You too? How quickly you've been trained to accept American charity." Sergeant Washington, supervising the meal distribution, heard this exchange, but gave no indication that he understood German. His face remained professionally impassive. The next morning brought Sunday services. Attendance was voluntary, with Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish services offered in different locations around the camp. A surprising number of prisoners attended, some out of genuine religious conviction, others simply for a change of routine. Hoffman, raised Lutheran but not particularly devout, decided to attend the Protestant service. To his surprise, he found himself sitting near Private Wilson and several other black guards who were off duty. The service was conducted by a white chaplain who made no acknowledgement of the mixed congregation beyond a perfunctory good morning to all. His sermon focused on duty and obedience to authority, safe, uncontroversial themes appropriate for a military setting. As they filed out after the service, Hoffman found himself walking beside Wilson. "Do all American military services emphasize obedience so strongly?" Hoffman asked, genuinely curious. Wilson chuckled softly. Only when the brass is listening. When our own chaplain preaches to just us, he talks more about freedom and justice, the kind the Bible actually mentions. This glimpse of religious segregation, even divine guidance tailored to reinforce social hierarchies, struck Hoffman as profoundly revealing. The system these men served within constrained them at every turn, yet they maintained their own understanding of higher principles. The relative calm of Sunday was shattered the following morning when Hauptmann Keller created an incident during breakfast. As a server placed a tray before him, Keller deliberately knocked it to the floor. "I will not eat food served by an Untermensch," he declared loudly in German, using the Nazi term for subhuman. The server, Private Cooper, didn't understand the specific word, but certainly recognized the deliberate insult. He maintained his composure, simply retrieving the fallen tray without comment. "You will clean this mess," Sergeant Jefferson ordered Keller in English, stepping forward from his supervisory position. "I will not," Keller replied in accented but clear English. "German officers do not take orders from—" Before he could complete the slur, Hoffman interrupted. "Hauptmann Keller, with respect, the Geneva Convention requires officers to maintain military discipline among prisoners. Creating disorder in the mess hall violates that responsibility." Keller's face flushed with anger at being contradicted by a non-commissioned officer. But the appeal to the Geneva Convention, which indeed required captured officers to assist in maintaining discipline, left him momentarily without retort. Jefferson seized the opening. "Either clean the mess you made, or lose mess privileges for 3 days. Your choice, Captain." After a tense moment, Keller stooped to gather the spilled food, his face rigid with suppressed fury. The incident seemed resolved, but Hoffman knew better. Keller had been publicly humiliated, and men like him did not forget such things. Later that day, as Hoffman supervised a work detail clearing brush near the camp perimeter, Keller approached him. "You undermined my authority this morning, Oberfeldwebel," Keller said coldly. "I prevented an unnecessary confrontation, Herr Hauptmann," Hoffman replied. "Creating incidents gains us nothing. It demonstrates that we remain German soldiers, not broken men who accept Negro authority without question." Hoffman straightened, meeting Keller's gaze directly. "With respect, sir, what would such a demonstration achieve? The Americans would impose penalties, perhaps reduce rations or privileges. To what end?" "To maintain our honor as German soldiers," Keller insisted. "Is honor served by childish displays in a mess hall?" Hoffman asked quietly. "Or by conducting ourselves with dignity even in captivity?" Keller studied him with narrowed eyes. "You have been here too long, Hoffman. You're thinking like a prisoner, not a soldier." "Perhaps I am thinking like a human being first, and a soldier second," Hoffman suggested. The conversation might have continued, but they were interrupted by the arrival of Captain Drummond, making one of his frequent inspection rounds. Drummond approached, trailed by Sergeant Jefferson and 2 armed guards. "What's going on here?" Drummond demanded. "No prisoner gatherings outside of authorized activities." "A simple conversation between officers, Captain," Keller replied smoothly, emphasizing his rank. Drummond was unimpressed. "Get back to your assigned areas, both of you. Now." As they separated, Hoffman caught a calculating look in Keller's eyes that concerned him. The Hauptmann was planning something, and whatever it was would likely make an already tense situation worse. That evening, Hoffman sought out Schmidt in the barracks. "Keller is becoming a problem," he said quietly. "He's determined to create incidents to prove his ideological points." Schmidt nodded. "Several of the new men are following his lead. They've been making comments, small provocations toward the guards." "This will not end well," Hoffman predicted. "What do you suggest?" "We cannot control an officer, especially one so committed to the party line." Hoffman had no answer. As a non-commissioned officer, his authority was limited, particularly over a commissioned officer like Keller. All he could do was try to maintain discipline among his own men and hope that Keller's provocations didn't escalate. His hopes were dashed the very next morning. As the prisoners assembled for roll call, Keller and 6 other new arrivals remained seated on their bunks, refusing to fall in. Hauptmann Keller, All prisoners must present for count, Sergeant Jefferson ordered from the barracks doorway. I do not recognize your authority, Keller replied coldly. I will comply with orders from a proper officer, not a Negro in a costume. The barracks fell silent. Even Keller's supporters seemed uncomfortable with the explicit challenge to camp authority. Everyone understood that such direct insubordination could not go unanswered. Jefferson's face revealed nothing as he turned to one of his men. Get Lieutenant Ellis and Captain Drummond. While they waited, tension filled the barracks. Hoffman stepped forward. Herr Hauptmann, this is unwise, he said in German. You risk punishments that will affect all prisoners. Stand down, Oberfeldwebel, Keller snapped. Your concern for American convenience is noted. Minutes later, Lieutenant Ellis arrived with Captain Drummond. After Jefferson explained the situation, Drummond's thin face twisted with anger. On your feet, Captain Keller, Drummond ordered. You and your men will present for count immediately or face disciplinary action. Keller rose slowly, his expression contemptuous. I am an officer of the Wehrmacht. Under the Geneva Convention, I am required to give only my name, rank, and serial number. I am not required to participate in your counts or follow orders from inferior personnel. Drummond's face reddened. Article 9 of the Convention states that POWs must obey the laws and regulations of the detaining power. Roll call is a regulation. Your legal objection is denied. The captain's knowledge of the exact article surprised Hoffman. Perhaps Drummond was more complex than he had initially appeared. Furthermore, Drummond continued, your deliberate attempt to organize resistance among prisoners is a violation of camp regulations that can result in disciplinary measures, including solitary confinement. For a moment, it seemed Keller might escalate further. Then, with deliberate slowness, he gestured to his followers. We will comply, under protest. Your protest is noted, Drummond replied coldly. Now fall in. The confrontation seemed diffused, but as the prisoners filed outside for the count, Keller muttered something to one of his followers. Hoffman, standing nearby, caught only fragments. Tonight, teach them. That evening, as dusk settled over the camp, Hoffman noticed Keller and his core group speaking quietly among themselves, breaking off whenever other prisoners approached. Their furtive behavior confirmed his suspicions. They were planning some form of action. Hoffman debated what to do. Warning the guards would be seen as betrayal by his fellow prisoners. Not warning them might allow Keller to create a dangerous situation. In the end, he decided on a middle path. As the kitchen detail finished cleaning after the evening meal, Hoffman approached Sergeant Washington. There may be trouble tonight, he said quietly. Some of the new arrivals are restless. Washington studied him carefully. You're telling me this why, Sergeant Hoffman? Because unnecessary conflict serves no one, Hoffman replied. Neither prisoners nor guards. Washington nodded slowly. I appreciate the heads up. I'll make sure we're prepared without making it obvious you said anything. Hoffman returned to the barracks to find Keller and his followers had disappeared. A quick inquiry revealed they had received permission to use the camp showers, a normal evening activity but suspicious given Keller's earlier behavior. Around 9:30 p.m., as the prisoners prepared for lights out, a commotion erupted from the direction of the guards' quarters. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass, and then a warning whistle, the signal for an emergency. Most prisoners crowded near the barracks windows, trying to see what was happening. In the distance, they could make out a fire burning in a trash barrel near the black guards' quarters. Figures were moving in the darkness, voices raised in anger. What did they do? Schmidt asked, appearing at Hoffman's elbow. Something stupid, Hoffman replied grimly. Minutes later, the barracks door burst open. Lieutenant Ellis, accompanied by armed guards, entered with a face like thunder. Everyone remain in place, he ordered. There has been an incident. Until we determine what happened and who was involved, all prisoners are confined to barracks. Anyone caught outside will be considered attempting escape and dealt with accordingly. As Ellis conducted a count, it became apparent that Keller and 3 others were missing. Ellis noted their absence without comment and departed, posting guards outside the barracks. The prisoners exploded into speculation as soon as Ellis left. They must have attacked the guards' quarters, one man suggested. Or tried to escape and offered another. Idiots, Schmidt muttered. Whatever they did will make things worse for all of us. Hoffman said nothing, but inwardly he agreed. Keller's misguided attempt to assert some form of racial superiority or resistance would inevitably result in tighter restrictions and possibly lost privileges for everyone. The missing men were returned to the barracks shortly after midnight, escorted by grim-faced guards. Keller's face was bruised, his uniform torn and dirty. The others showed similar signs of rough handling. No explanation was offered, and the guards departed without comment, locking the barracks door behind them. What happened? Several prisoners demanded once the guards were gone. Keller sat heavily on his bunk. "We taught the Negroes a lesson they won't forget," he said, though his bravado seemed hollow given his bedraggled state. One of his followers was more forthcoming. "We set fire to their mail as they were sorting it," he explained. "Letters from home, packages, everything went up in flames." A murmur ran through the barracks. Even those sympathetic to Keller's ideology understood the cruelty of destroying personal mail, the tenuous connection to loved ones that made captivity bearable. "And how did that end for you?" Hoffman asked pointedly, gesturing to their injuries. "They caught us," and Keller admitted, "outnumbered us." "What did you expect?" Schmidt demanded. "That they would stand by while you destroyed their personal possessions, their letters from family?" "I expected German soldiers to understand the importance of resistance," Keller shot back. "This wasn't resistance," Hoffman said quietly. "It was spite. Childish and cruel." The barracks fell silent. Whatever support Keller might have hoped to gain had evaporated in the face of what most prisoners, regardless of their political beliefs, recognized as a dishonorable action. The next morning revealed the consequences. Captain Drummond addressed the assembled prisoners at roll call. "Last night, 4 prisoners committed vandalism and destruction of personal property," he announced. "The guilty parties have been identified and will face appropriate discipline. In addition, all prisoners will experience the following restrictions for the next 2 weeks. No mail privileges, no personal items from Red Cross packages, and no recreational activities." A groan went up from the assembled men. Drummond raised his hand for silence. "These measures are not negotiable. Furthermore, any future incidents will result in more severe restrictions." He paused, surveying the prisoners. "That is all." As the prisoners dispersed to their work details, resentment toward Keller and his followers was palpable. The loss of mail privileges was especially bitter, striking at one of the few comforts of prison camp life. Hoffman's kitchen detail that day was supervised by Private Wilson, whose normally friendly demeanor had been replaced by stony silence. As they worked, Hoffman noticed Wilson repeatedly checking a photograph he kept in his pocket, presumably a precious item that had survived the fire. Finally, Hoffman spoke. "I am sorry about what happened to your mail." Wilson looked at him for a long moment before responding. "My wife's last 3 letters were in that pile. And a picture of our baby nephew." He returned to his duties without further comment. Throughout the day, similar interactions occurred across the camp. Guards who had begun to treat prisoners with cautious respect now maintained rigid distance. The fragile bridges of human connection that had been forming were now damaged, perhaps irreparably. That evening, as the prisoners ate their dinner in sullen silence, Hoffman made a decision. After the meal, he approached First Sergeant Jefferson. "I request permission to speak with Captain Drummond," he said formally. Jefferson raised an eyebrow. "Regarding?" "A proposal to restore certain privileges to prisoners not involved in last night's incident." Jefferson considered this. "I'll pass your request up the chain. Don't expect much." To Hoffman's surprise, Drummond agreed to see him the following morning. He was escorted to the camp administration building and ushered into a sparse office where Drummond sat behind a military-issue desk. "You have 5 minutes, Sergeant Hoffman," Drummond said without preamble. "State your business." "Sir, I wish to propose that mail privileges be restored to those prisoners who had no involvement in the incident 2 nights ago," Hoffman began. "The actions of 4 men should not deprive all prisoners of contact with their families." Drummond leaned back in his chair. "Collective punishment is an effective deterrent against future misconduct. With respect, sir, it also breeds resentment among those who followed regulations, Hoffman countered. "Most prisoners disapprove of what Hauptmann Keller and his men did. Is that so?" Drummond seemed genuinely curious. "I was under the impression that Keller's attitudes reflected those of most German prisoners." "No, sir. Many of us recognize that we are being treated fairly under the circumstances. The destruction of personal mail was dishonorable." Drummond studied him thoughtfully. "You're an unusual German, Sergeant Hoffman. I am simply a soldier who respects military protocol, sir. Personal mail has no strategic value. Destroying it served no military purpose." After a moment's consideration, Drummond nodded. "I'll consider your proposal. That will be all." As Hoffman was escorted back to his barracks, he wondered if his intervention would make any difference. Drummond struck him as rigid and bureaucratic, unlikely to show flexibility. Yet the following day, a notice was posted in all barracks. Mail privileges would be restored to all prisoners except those directly involved in the incident. The other restrictions would remain in place for 1 week instead of the originally stated 2. This partial reprieve was met with relief by most prisoners. Even more significantly, it established Hoffman as someone who could effectively mediate between prisoners and camp authorities, a position that carried both influence and risk. Keller, confined to quarters as part of his punishment, was furious when he heard of Hoffman's intervention. "You undermined a legitimate act of resistance," he accused when Hoffman visited him. "You're collaborating with the enemy. I prevented your foolishness from punishing innocent men," Hoffman replied evenly. "Men who simply want to hear from their families. Their comfort is irrelevant. What matters is maintaining German honor and resistance." "Is there honor in burning letters from another man's wife and children?" Hoffman asked quietly. "Would you consider it honorable if an American burned letters from your family?" Keller had no answer to this. For all his ideological fervor, he could not entirely dismiss the basic human connection Hoffman had invoked. Over the next few days, a fragile normalcy returned to Camp Claiborne. The guards maintained a professional distance, but the outright hostility following Keller's action gradually faded. Work details resumed their usual routines, meals were served without incident, and the rhythms of prison camp life reasserted themselves. Then came July 4th, American Independence Day. The camp schedule was modified to allow American personnel time for celebration. Prisoners remained confined to barracks or work details, but they could hear music and festivities from the American sections of the camp. In the kitchen, where Hoffman and his detail were preparing the evening meal, Sergeant Washington made an unexpected announcement. "Special rations for today," he said, indicating several boxes that had just been delivered. Headquarters authorized a holiday meal for everyone, prisoners included. The boxes contained ingredients for a traditional American Independence Day meal: beef for hamburgers, potatoes for salad, and even ingredients for apple pie. It was far more elaborate than the usual prison fare. Why would they provide special food for German prisoners on an American holiday? Schmidt wondered as they worked. Geneva Convention doesn't require it, Hoffman agreed. It's unexpected. As they prepared the meal, Washington explained the significance of Independence Day to the German prisoners working in the kitchen. "Today's when we celebrate telling the British we wouldn't be their colony anymore," he said. "Declared that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights." "All men?" Hoffman asked pointedly, thinking of the segregated facilities around them. Washington's expression was complex, part pride, part irony. "That's what the document says. America is still figuring out what that really means. But the words matter. They give us something to hold the country to." This concept, of patriotism based not on blood or soil, but on an evolving ideal, was foreign to the German conception of national identity that Hoffman had been taught. It sparked a thoughtful discussion as they worked, with Washington explaining how many black Americans viewed their military service as both a patriotic duty and a claim to full citizenship. "Fighting for a country that doesn't treat you as equal?" Schmidt asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why not refuse?" "Because America belongs to us too," Washington replied simply. "We are fighting for what America should be, not just what it is now." As the special meal was served that evening, Hoffman watched the prisoners' reactions. Most were pleasantly surprised by the quality and quantity of the food. A few, particularly Keller's supporters, made a show of reluctance before eventually eating. Across the compound, they could see the American personnel having their own celebration. The white officers and enlisted men gathered in one area, the black soldiers in another, the familiar segregation still in place even during a holiday. Yet Hoffman noticed something else too. Despite the physical separation, both groups were celebrating the same holiday, expressing pride in the same national ideals. The contradiction was striking. A nation founded on principles of equality, visibly failing to fulfill those principles, yet still invoking them as a shared heritage. The next morning brought another unexpected development. A notice was posted announcing that a delegation from the International Red Cross would be visiting Camp Claiborne the following week to inspect conditions and interview randomly selected prisoners. This was standard procedure under the Geneva Convention, but it created a stir among both prisoners and guards. Camp authorities immediately initiated a flurry of activity, repainting buildings, improving ground maintenance, ensuring all facilities were in perfect order. Captain Drummond summoned the senior prisoners, including Hoffman, to his office. "The Red Cross delegation will ask about your treatment," he informed them. "You are expected to answer honestly. If there have been legitimate issues with camp conditions, this is the appropriate channel to address them." The implication was clear. Any complaints should go through official channels, not take the form of destructive actions like Keller's. As the camp prepared for inspection, Hoffman observed an interesting phenomenon. The drive to present the camp in its best condition resulted in improvements that benefited everyone, prisoners and guards alike. Fresh paint, repaired facilities, even slightly improved rations became the norm in the days preceding the visit. Even more noteworthy was a subtle shift in Captain Drummond's approach. His rigid enforcement of segregation seemed to soften somewhat as he focused on ensuring the camp would pass international scrutiny. When Sergeant Washington proposed a more efficient arrangement for the mess hall that would reduce separation between areas, Drummond approved it without comment. Keller, still restricted to limited duties, viewed these developments with suspicion. "They're creating an illusion for the Red Cross," he told anyone who would listen. "Once the inspection is over, conditions will deteriorate again." While there was truth to this cynicism, Hoffman had been in the camp long enough to recognize that the baseline standard of treatment was generally fair. The improvements might be motivated by the coming inspection, but the fundamental adherence to the Geneva Convention had been consistent. The day before the Red Cross delegation was due to arrive, a special mail delivery reached the camp. Among the letters was one for Hoffman from his wife, dated more recently than her previous communication. As he opened it with trembling hands, a photograph fell out. His daughter in her school uniform, smiling despite the privations of wartime Germany. The letter contained mixed news. His family was safe, but Hamburg had suffered intensive bombing. Their apartment building remained intact, but many neighboring structures had been destroyed. Food was increasingly scarce. His wife's parents had moved in with them after losing their own home. Despite these hardships, the letter was remarkably free of bitterness. His wife wrote of neighbors helping each other, of small kindnesses amid devastation. She mentioned that a British bomber had been shot down near their district and that local Germans had pulled the wounded airmen from the wreckage before turning them over to authorities. "Even in war," she wrote, "we must remember our common humanity." The phrase struck Hoffman forcefully. It echoed his own evolving thoughts, arrived at through his experiences with the Black American Guards, men who, despite being treated as second class by their own society, had demonstrated a fundamental decency that transcended the divisions of war and ideology. That evening, Hoffman showed the photograph of his daughter to Schmidt and several other prisoners he had come to trust. As they admired the image and spoke of their own families, Private Cooper approached their table. "Mail call brought good news?" he asked. Hoffman hesitated only briefly before showing him the photograph. "My daughter," he said simply. Cooper smiled. "She has your eyes. How old?" "7 now," Hoffman replied. "This is her school picture." "I've got a niece about that age," Cooper said, "crazy about jumping rope and fairy tales." "Mine too," Hoffman found himself saying, "and she collects butterflies." It was a simple exchange. the kind that would occur between any two fathers or uncles anywhere in the world. Yet in the context of a POW camp in 1943, between men whose countries were locked in existential combat, it represented something profound. Keller, passing by at that moment, observed the interaction with visible disgust. "Shameful," he muttered in German, fraternizing with them as if they were equals. Hoffmann met his gaze steadily. "They are human beings, Herr Hauptmann, as are we." "They are the enemy," Keller insisted. "Yes," Hoffmann acknowledged, "but being an enemy does not make one less than human. That is the lie that brought us to this war." The words emerged without premeditation, but as soon as Hoffmann spoke them, he recognized their truth. The dehumanization at the core of Nazi ideology, the sorting of humanity into categories of more and less worthy, was not merely a political position. It was a fundamental error, one that his experiences at Camp Claiborne had exposed. The Red Cross delegation arrived the next morning, 3 Swiss officials in civilian attire, accompanied by American military liaison officers. They conducted a thorough inspection of the facilities, interviewed randomly selected prisoners in private, and reviewed camp records. Hoffmann was among those chosen for an interview. In a small office, away from both American authorities and fellow prisoners, he spoke candidly with a Swiss doctor named Müller. "The conditions are adequate?" Müller asked in German. "Yes," Hoffmann confirmed. "Food is sufficient, medical care is appropriate, work details are not excessive." "And treatment by the guards. We understand they are primarily Negro soldiers." "They are professional and fair," Hoffmann stated. "There have been no abuses." Müller raised an eyebrow. "This differs from some other reports we have received from German POWs in America." "I can speak only of what I have witnessed here," Hoffmann replied. "The guards follow regulations. Some have shown unexpected kindness." The interview continued with questions about specific aspects of camp life. Throughout, Hoffmann maintained his assessment. Conditions at Camp Claiborne met or exceeded the requirements of the Geneva Convention. As the delegation completed their inspection and prepared to depart, Captain Drummond assembled both prisoners and guards for a final address by the senior Red Cross official. "We have found conditions at Camp Claiborne to be in compliance with international standards," the Swiss official announced. "Minor recommendations will be submitted to camp authorities, but overall, the facility meets or exceeds requirements for humane treatment of prisoners of war." This official validation seemed to release some tension in the camp. Guards appeared more relaxed, and many prisoners expressed satisfaction that their treatment had been deemed appropriate by neutral observers. That evening, as Hoffmann's kitchen detail finished cleaning after dinner, Sergeant Washington made an unexpected announcement. "Tomorrow's my last day here," he told them. "I've been transferred to a new unit shipping out next week." "Where to?" asked Cooper. "Can't say specifically. Pacific Theater is all I know." The news was surprising. Washington had been a fixture in the camp kitchen, his steady presence a constant amid the changing dynamics between prisoners and guards. "Who will replace you?" Hoffmann asked. "Corporal Thomas is being promoted to sergeant. He'll take over the kitchen." Washington smiled slightly. "He'll keep you boys in line." The following day brought an unexpected gesture. As Washington completed his final shift, the German kitchen workers presented him with a small carved wooden spoon crafted in secret by one of the prisoners who had been a woodworker in civilian life. "For the best cook in Louisiana," Schmidt said as he handed over the gift. Washington accepted it with evident surprise. "Thank you. Didn't expect anything like this." "Good sergeants deserve recognition," Hoffmann said simply, "regardless of uniform." That night, after lights out, Hoffmann lay awake thinking about Washington's departure. The sergeant had been one of the first to challenge Hoffmann's preconceptions, not through arguments or ideology, but through simple human decency. The sharing of bacon had been the first crack in a worldview built on assumed superiority and fundamental difference. In the darkness, Hoffmann could hear soft conversation from nearby bunks. Other prisoners were awake too, discussing the day's events, the Red Cross inspection, Washington's transfer. The tone was thoughtful, reflective. "They're just men, aren't they?" came Schmidt's voice from the adjacent bunk. "Not so different from us." "Who?" asked another prisoner. "The guards, the black Americans. They want the same things we do: letters from home, decent food, respect, an end to the war. "Be careful, Schmidt," warned another voice, one of Keller's supporters. "That kind of talk is dangerous. More dangerous than the lies that sent us to war," Schmidt challenged. "More dangerous than believing some men are born superior to others?" The barracks fell silent, but Hoffman knew the conversation was happening in many minds. The experience of captivity had created an unexpected opportunity, the chance to see beyond the categories and stereotypes that had defined their understanding of the world. The next morning dawned with a familiar routine: roll call, breakfast, assignment to work details. As Hoffman led his kitchen crew to their duties, they passed the camp gates where a transport truck was waiting. Sergeant Washington, duffel bag in hand, was preparing to depart. On impulse, Hoffman called his men to attention and saluted. Washington, surprised, returned the gesture with a nod before climbing into the truck. It was a small moment, unnoticed by most of the camp. Yet for Hoffman, it represented something profound, an acknowledgement of respect that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and nation. In the kitchen, work proceeded under Sergeant Thomas's supervision. As they prepared lunch, Private Miller entered with a package. "Last of Washington's personal items," he explained. "He said to share them before they go to waste." Inside the package were several food items from home: cornmeal, preserved fruits, and at the bottom, a few precious strips of home-cured bacon. "Smells like freedom," Cooper joked as Miller began frying the bacon. The aroma filled the kitchen, rich and evocative, triggering memories of that first morning weeks ago when Miller had shared his personal rations. The scent was the same, but Hoffman's perception of it had transformed entirely. Then, it had been an unexpected kindness from an enemy. Now, it represented something more profound, a recognition of shared humanity that cut through the abstractions of ideology and the artificial divisions of war. As the bacon sizzled in the pan, German prisoners and Black American guards worked side by side, momentarily united by the simple pleasure of food prepared with care. In that ordinary moment, Hoffman recognized an extraordinary truth. The differences that had seemed so fundamental, so immutable, were in fact far less significant than the common humanity they all shared. The war would continue. They remained captives and captors, separated by uniform and circumstance. Yet something essential had changed, not in the world around them, but in how they perceived that world and each other. And it had begun with the simple, unexpected aroma of bacon frying on a hot Louisiana morning. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.